Hello and welcome to another edition of For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm here with my guest, Jim Zemlicka. He is a FEMA reservist. This is actually part two. Hopefully you got a chance to see part one. But if not, Jim, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll kind of do a little bit of recap and talk about FEMA reservist, what that is, because it certainly doesn't do justice to what you actually do for a living.
Well, it doesn't. It's a generic term, but we have two employees in FEMA, basically, and that is our permanent full-time people that work in both in Washington and the different 10 regions, and then we are the reserve people or the backup crew that when a disaster is declared, we come in with certain subject matter experts to disseminate information and to handle the disaster and help the people.
Now, for those that might not have seen the first show, to start with your humble beginnings, you were kind of drafted by FEMA because of your very talented ability to keep structures up during disasters, like a hurricane or something like that, where others around you got knocked down, yours stayed up, and the government wanted to know how you did it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was during 1989, Hurricane Hugo in the Virgin Islands. The damage to the island was like 90% of all the structures were pretty well wiped out. Power was down for 5 months, and FEMA came by. I didn't know who they were, to be honest with you. I knew that they were a federal agency, but and they wanted to know if I would help them out.
And they showed up all Men in Black style too, didn't they?
Yeah, well, that was
that was like the intimidation
discerning
thing. Yeah.
A little bit, but that's the U.S. Marshals. That's what they normally wear.
Yeah.
They probably regretted it being in 85-degree weather.
Yeah, they weren't. No wonder they weren't smiling. And they were all serious.
Right. Very
but anyway,
serious.
Because of your success with your buildings and how the structures worked, they wanted to know how you did it, and they wanted to be able to spread your abilities to others.
Exactly. We put together, myself and a number of other people within our mitigation division, a book that would explain how to build 1 and 2 family homes in an earthquake and hurricane zone, because down there the dynamics, that's their two big elements of risk. And it was rewarding, and after that was done, they asked if I wouldn't mind coming to another disaster in the future, and I went back to work building the homes and repairing a lot of the things that were busted up pretty bad on the island. So, and it did happen in a couple of little things, but in 1995, Hurricane Marilyn struck the islands again, this time on the island of St. Thomas, more so than on St. Croix. And I was recruited in at that time to work with them to do structure failure analysis and show the people how to build and how to build against these elements. A hurricane, like a tornado, is an extreme dynamic, but you can limit or reduce your damage if you know how to build and how to join your home together.
There's some rare cases where a hurricane can spawn a tornado, right? Those two things can go hand
Yeah,
in hand.
it's actually a tornadic type wind. If you a spinning funnel cloud that is formed, but it's not. It's spawned off of the interaction of wind blowing in and around buildings and structures. You get two buildings that are so far apart, all that wind has to funnel between the two of them. When it hits the other side, it goes around the corner and it spins. There's a drag to a building anyhow. And so it spins, but that for a moment, maybe it only lasts 10 seconds, but that little guy can cause an awful lot of damage, where a tornado starts out horizontally and then it comes down to the earth as the two fronts clash.
And what is a superstorm, which is what we had with Superstorm Sandy, which started out as a hurricane, but it kind of turned into a superstorm?
Well, we get into generics of how you name these things, but basically it was a tropical storm that's turned into a hurricane. It's a large vortex of wind spinning counterclockwise, and it comes ashore, and of course it raises havoc.
And one of the many things that we mentioned on the first show, part one, was someone in your field sort of almost has to become a de facto meteorologist. Some of the stuff that you were talking to me about, those were questions that you'd ask a meteorologist, right?
Well, pretty much so. Of course, we're tied into the Hurricane Center and NOAA and the National Storm Center out in Norman, Oklahoma. So we're fed information all the time, and just by osmosis, you gather a lot of this knowledge.
Yeah.
But a supercell is a cloud, it's a cumulonimbus cloud is the proper term. It's a gathering, a vortex that is already spinning, and the tunnel or the wind current is being drawn up into the upper atmosphere. That's why they call it a thunderhead. And when they get up into 40, 50,000 feet and they start to kick off like this because of the trade winds, that is a big storm. That's a supercell. And then they spawn smaller ones around the outside of it.
So, since people watching this show are in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, right along that shoreline, let's talk about what affects this neck of the woods most, as far as damage, disasters, hurricanes, all that.
Right. Besides winter storms, we
Right.
all know about and have lived with them for our whole life, these storms just come around once in a while. Of course, they're coming more often than not lately because of our melting ice caps. But what we're most concerned about, my element of expertise lies in good construction in a more violent zone. In this case would be a V zone on a flood map because the currents build up. The storm pushes water ahead of itself, and it actually causes basically a super tide, if you will. But it's accompanied with the wind. So now you get the water depth, you get the velocity of the water moving, the dynamics that it plays on a home or a foundation are pretty impressive. So you have to, if you insist on living on the beach and you want to stay there, you're going to have to build for it. The old homes that have been here for many, many years, they're depleting. Although they may have new siding on them and new roof, they're getting weaker and weaker.
But I would argue that these old, big Victorian houses, or whatever you want to call them, the fact that they've been here, still standing through so many hurricanes and other storms, when they did something right way back when they did build them.
Well, they did. They built with better foundations. They built with pilings that were driven into the sand, which you've got to get down at least 2 times deeper than the height of the pile above the sand. Those held up quite well, but when they do a post and pier, when they scuff away a little sand and pour a little concrete pad and develop a concrete column, they're easily eroded out.
Right.
When that storm surge comes in, it gulps sand. I mean, it just gulps it. You can lose 4 or 5 feet of sand on a beach, and all of a sudden you realize that there is no sand, it's just rock. And it takes it years for that sand to build up, or mankind placing it on the beach.
I thought it was fascinating. I watched a documentary about how they build skyscrapers in Manhattan. Depending on where you are in Manhattan, a certain section, the buildings are taller, and another section, depending on how far you go down into the mantle or whatever it is, it's fascinating what they do about how far you have to go down. And you're on an island, so you have to deal with the fact that water is there.
Well, unbeknownst to most people, I mean, everybody's building over water, whether it's on the land or out in the ocean. You drill down deep enough, you've got water.
Right.
So this is why you hire a good engineer to come out and do a soils analysis. They do borings. They can tell you what the strata of the rocks are, where they begin, where they stop, where there's a void. On the coastline of Connecticut, which is basically the lowlands of the state, as the mountain range met the ocean, and you'll go down 30, 40 feet in sand, and all of a sudden you'll poke into peat moss. The old swamp that eons ago, it's still there.
If there was no cities, then that's what would be here now, right?
Basically, yeah. But the cities or the coastline towns are built on this, and it's as stable as any other ground that's inland. You just have to know that fact. You don't want your foundation to go beyond that limit because you're going to be in a weaker soil. You can get the support you need just staying in the sand base, but you've got to be deep enough. Plus there's frost to consider. I think around here the frost depth is somewhere between 36 and 48 inches. Check with your local building code people. They know exactly where the frost level is. You have to be at that depth at least to protect the footing. But because of this erosion problem, you have to go beyond that to get the stability necessary to prevent overturning of the building or the foundation of your home. Then, of course, the house built on top of these piles has to have good structural continuity from the earth all the way to the peak of the roof. And there's many ways to accomplish that, many different new tools and appliances, plates, connector plates, stainless steel bolts, stainless steel nails.
How did the pyramids get built? How did they do that? You're a structural engineer. How'd they do it?
Very slowly.
Yeah, very slow.
I wish I could know that. It's one of those mysteries that everybody says, how are they able to do so much with so little? The thing is, our ancient civilizations were a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Absolutely.
Our engineers today engineer around some of those problems. They say, well, why have a wall that's 2 and 3 feet thick, which is the way we used to build? Why don't we just build it this thick? Well, what do we do differently? Well, less materials is better, so we're going to develop structures that will actually stand, not to that extent, but strong enough to make a home. So we've lessened our building abilities because of the cost and manpower.
Right. And also real estate too, right? Like if you're trying to cram buildings into New York, you know.
Right. Every square inch is worth more than I make, probably. You know.
That's very true. Now, if you, like you were saying before, if you insist on living on the beach, is it just a fact of life that beach erosion will exist, or will happen?
Absolutely. I can take you to places on Staten Island, Richmond County, New York, where there used to be a subdivision and roads. And the first tier of homes disappeared after a storm, then the road, then the second tier.
Wow.
And now all of a sudden the last road on the beach has been completely decimated and gone. The fire plugs are still there. They're not connected to the water supply, but it was the strangest thing to walk on that beach and see a fire hydrant and say, what are you going to put out on a beach? Are they just trying to put out the bonfires? And they say, oh no, there used to be a community here.
Wow.
The nature of the earth, the physics of the earth, is everything wants to wash off into the ocean by wind or water. It's an erosion thing. The Appalachian Mountains, which is the oldest mountain range in the continental United States, has depleted to the point where there's no more craggy mountains. They're all covered with timber. You go out west where I live, you still have the shards of granite that are sticking up way above the timberline. They have yet to decay and collapse. But every time it snows, the water trickles into the rocks, it freezes, the rocks get pushed apart and they crumble and they turn into sand. And then that goes into the water mix and goes out the other side. So eventually, the earth wants to settle itself.
Is that because of climate change? Are humans partly responsible for that, or is that just natural processes?
No, humans have nothing to do with it. It's all a matter of tectonic plates and how the continents are drifting from one side to the other. And in one area they're splitting, and in other areas they're colliding. So it's just the nature of how our Earth was created.
If you allow the Earth to exist, deep into the future, maybe the continents will look very different than they do now. I mean, it was all one continent in the beginning, right?
Right. New York could be somewhere around Chicago. We're not sure, but the things are drifting. The Hawaiian Islands are a good example. There's a chain of islands. The biggest island is Hawaii, where the active volcanoes are. And as you look back in history, and these geologists, as I'm told, all the chain started at that same point, but they drifted away. And as they got further and further away from that hot spot, they became dormant. And there's another island just south of Hawaii right now, a sea mountain they call it, that is forming underwater, and it's yet to raise its head. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but it's coming.
But buy some property there cheap if you put in your bid now.
Yeah, buy ocean.
So bringing it back to building, depending on knowing your geography will determine how you build, and going back to your ability to keep structures up where others failed. Two identical buildings or two identical houses, just some small, minute things, brackets even, could be the difference between the house standing and a house that got knocked down because of a storm.
You can have a well-built home, and at the foundation, if you didn't anchor it to the foundation, you're going to lose it anyhow. People kind of miss that whole idea. It's just like our human bodies. The most important part of our body is our feet. Without it, we couldn't stand upright. We would fall over, basically. That's our footing. So that holds us up, but people forget that a footing also holds the house down. And so if a well-connected home from that footing, like a mushroom anchor that the sailors here know what that is, if it goes in the mud too deep, you can't hardly get it out. You have to apply constant pressure or tugging on it to get it up out of that mud. But in the presence of a building, that dynamics of holding all of that concrete down or holding the base of that foundation into the earth gives it the stability to prevent overturning. Now you have to build a home so that it's all connected together. There's tension rods that can be put in, regular cables that run down and that you can tighten them up as a turnbuckle, and you build pressure on it. There are even bolts that have loaded springs, so you tighten down the bolt, compress the spring, and as the wood would shrink, it still maintains the tension, but the spring is allowed to travel. You may have to go in the attic and tighten them up in a few years because all wood shrinks.
Right. I want to talk now about, we talk about disasters and big things like hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards, but a very tiny culprits that can cause damage, mold. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, mold, of course, mold has been on this earth before mankind even set foot on it. It's part of our nature, it's part of our makeup. It's an organism that grows, it feeds on anything organic. Basically, we're organic, wood is organic, all plant life is organic. Just think of what New England would look like if the leaves wouldn't crumble and decay and turn into earth. The leaves would be higher than the trees.
Right, yeah, it'd be a giant pile.
So it's a process, and there's many types of molds that attack different things differently. There are some toxic molds. Ones that I know of that are extremely serious are really over in Asia, and we don't talk about them here too much. But mold is among us here in the studio. The carpet's filled with mold spores. But because there's no moisture to awaken the seed, they lie dormant. But they're an irritant. That's why we vacuum, we clean, and whatnot. But if you breathe it, it can be an irritant. It can get in your eyes, just like ragweed or any pollen that's going on right now outside. I park my car and I come back out of it, it's just covered with a green mist with all the fine pollen.
It can actually
Same
affect
thing.
your health after a while too if you breathe it in too much, right?
Too much of it,
Yeah.
too much of any one thing is bad for you. You need to stay active, keep your lungs clear. But the human body is a miraculous machine. It really cleans itself. It does, unless you abuse it by overdosing it with the wrong chemicals or being subjected to mold too much. If you don't want to be in a home that's moldy or musty, because what you're smelling is that element that is harmful to you. So
Right.
you don't want to keep breathing. It's just like sticking your nose in a gas can. I mean, how long could you live if you smell that all the time?
Now, so bringing it to your role as a FEMA responder for what you do, a lot of places, like for example, the hurricanes that we've had recently, or Sandy, people were concerned about mold in not only the damage but also the mold from all the water.
Right. Well, here we go. Mold doesn't come necessarily with the floodwaters. The water brings the necessary catalyst to get that mold spore to spawn or to raise its little head and become a plant. In saying that, and that mold is in and everywhere, it's all over your walls, it's on your ceilings, but when that humidity comes up to above 35%, 40%, there's enough moisture in the air. You know what a humid day is. That's enough for these little mold spores to come back to life and start to grow. So the floodwaters will bring in mold spores because they'll float, and they'll start that mold growth after the water recedes. That's why it's so important to remove the water after an event. But the mold that you see growing on the walls and up on the ceiling, those spores were already there. When I was a kid going to Grandma's house, it was part of the tradition to go to their home, both in the spring and the fall, for spring and fall house cleaning, where she would get out a bucket and fill it with lukewarm water and put in some trisodium phosphate, TSP, buy it at any hardware store and the box stores. And she'd put on some gloves and she would wipe down all the walls. They did it thinking that it would take care of the bacteria and the viruses that came in with the winter and whatnot, which is true. It would wash them away, but it also took out the mold spores. Plus all the paint that they used back then contained white lead, which everybody painted their homes white on the interior before the color fad got old. But mold won't grow on lead, nor will it grow on zinc. It's just the way it is. It's a poison for it. But that's something that we don't do anymore. I don't know of anybody who does spring and fall house cleaning. They say, "Gee, the house is looking a little dingy." Well, I'll go down and get a couple of buckets of paint and we'll paint it. And so they just paint in all the dirt and say, "All right,
so
we're
it's
good."
trapped in there then, right?
But the mold spores go with it, and they're actually embedded in the paint. Now, this is a kind of a bad fact, but it is true. Latex paint is organic, and mold eats organic substances. So when that mold spore is given the right amount of water, it looks for the closest food at hand. The paint itself is the food it lives on.
Wow.
And it will literally clean the paint off the wall if left by itself.
So what's good today to take care of a mold situation yourself? Because like what we talked about in the first show, you are the first responder. So preventative stuff, what can you use?
Absolutely. As fast as you can, you dry out the house. I know it's humid outside. Open the windows, get the air to blow.
Have
Take
some
out,
fans going or
Get
something?
some fans going, get the circulation going. Anything that is wet and soaked, it's toast. Take carpeting, bad, take it out. You're not gonna want to put it back in. You're not gonna just want to vacuum it clean and say we're good.
Yeah.
It's the water underneath it is gonna lie there. The concrete or the wooden floors that it might be over are still saturated with water, so that mold is just having a heyday underneath the carpet. Remember, it doesn't need sunlight. It's not a photosynthesis type plant. So.
But okay, so that a person who has a little mold in their house, that's an easy way to take care of it. But what if a person's, because you as a FEMA person comes out and evaluates the situation, are there things that can be done when when that type of?
Well, the rule of thumb is if you have mold that covers your walls of more than 25 square feet, then you should probably call in a professional. It can get out of hand for you. But keep your home clean, dry it out as fast as you can, get rid of all the materials that have absorbed water, like mattresses, that you don't want to sleep on a bed that's gone underwater. But some things that have hard surfaces, the laminates, the glass, the porcelains, whatnot, wash them off, in soapy water, whatnot, dry them off, and they'll certainly survive.
All right, now I want to switch topics a little bit here because you are a man of many talents, Jim, and in a former life, you dealt with insurance. Okay. Now, when someone thinks of FEMA, FEMA is, disaster relief, and eventually some money could come down the pike from them, but also their own insurance is involved in the process too.
Right. Well, FEMA is the governing body, I guess you could say, over flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program was put together, of which now FEMA is a part of, because flood insurance actually came before FEMA. But we have been in the bucket of taking care of it, managing it, and see how we can improve upon it to get more people involved in purchasing it, because we have more and more people encroaching upon waterways, rivers, lakes.
And isn't it required, depending on where you live, if it's X amount of feet close?
Well, FEMA is the underwriter of the insurance. That's really it. After that, you have to buy it through a local insurance agent. Same person that you buy your auto and homeowners insurance, you'd buy your flood insurance. Parameters for insurance are the same thing. You must insure your home to 80% of its value, or else be subjected to a depreciated value when it comes time for a claim. That's important to know. The flood insurance is the minimum amount of protection you can do, or the mitigating thing that you could do, but it only protects you up to $250,000. That's the maximum insurance policy you can buy. Most of the homes on the coast down here are a lot more than that. But, if paid up to that maximum, hopefully you won't have the value of your home completely damaged or over 50%. So that $250,000 will go towards that. Contents are only insurable up to $100,000 for individual homeowners. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but again, at the rate that we're getting in, you can only collect insurance for people who collect on flood insurance from the pool of money that's put together from the premiums paid by people who buy the insurance.
Right. There's no magical pool of money that they can just grab from.
No, the magical pool is you and I and our tax dollars.
Right.
The government has to borrow from that fund to put into the insurance fund to pay these insurance claims. Basically, it's been subsidized. Those rates are changing. It's going to be that every individual that lives in the floodplain should buy insurance. Right. If they do and spread that risk over many, the premium will still go up, but it won't have to be catastrophic.
There's a big push now. They really let you know that floods are not covered on your basic homeowner's insurance. It's a separate insurance depending on where you live.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have a multiple claim, one for wind damage and one for flood damage. Your homeowner's policy does not cover the foundation. A flood insurance policy does cover the foundation. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
That's a big expense. If your home should be damaged by better than 50% of its market value, less the land, it's considered substantially damaged. The local communities have adopted a floodplain ordinance. It's the local authority, not the federal government's. We set out templates, or build templates for the people to say, here it is, fill in the blanks, put in, take out, whatever you think is necessary, but you have to pass it and adopt it at a local level. Once you do that, then that community is eligible to purchase flood insurance. And those that are in risk certainly should buy it. If you're going to get a new home and you have a mortgage on it, any bank that is federally insured, the FDIC, it is required that that home, if in a floodplain, must have flood insurance on it. So hence now we get into the floodplain maps. Where are you? go to your local building code officials and say, I need to know if I'm in or out of a floodplain. The maps are kept in their office. They're more than happy to help you. They're not the enemy, I've got to tell you that much. They're there to keep you safe.
So is flood insurance a requirement depending on where you live? Or I mean, it's
Well,
supplemental?
again, this is America. You can do whatever you want.
But you may be sorry down the road.
You may be forced into flood insurance because of the mortgage that you have. But if your home is fully paid for, there's nobody saying that
That's a
you
good
have
point.
to.
Yeah.
You're on your own. And again, when disaster hits, guess what? You're on your own.
Something else people might not be aware of, FEMA is for individuals and not businesses, right?
Well, yeah. It is both. The insurance limits, like I say, are $250,000 on the structure, $100,000 on contents for individuals, and it's $500,000 for building and $500,000 on contents for commercial buildings that are in flood zones. Now, those people who say, you know what, this water is getting closer and closer, and I'm in an X zone, I'm actually out of the flood zone. It'd really take a mega storm to get me. As long as they are residents within that community that has adopted a floodplain ordinance, they can buy it. I can live on top of a mountain and buy flood insurance. You say, why? Well, have you ever heard of flash floods? They come out of the mountains. So you don't have to necessarily live close to water, a river, a pond, or the ocean, to be subject to flooding. You can have it high up on the side of the hill. A flood is considered at least 2 acres of flooded land, of which there are 2 residents or 2 buildings in that, one of which is yours. So then you can get a mini declaration, not a declaration, excuse me, a mini claim for your home, but it has to exceed that.
Our friends on Musquamaca Beach, I found it interesting that, when you're talking about old buildings and you have to rebuild after a disaster, a lot of times you were grandfathered into a certain building code, and you suddenly, when you rebuild, you have to adhere to the new updated codes, which many things may be different that you have to upgrade to.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, you wouldn't want a home with a 100-year-old electrical system.
Right.
Believe me, it's really antiquated. It can't handle the amperage, and it needs to be updated. But the trigger here is that when there's damage to a home, that 50% level. In some communities adopt it, some don't, and that is this substantial damage ruling, that it says if in the last 10 years you've had 1 or more incidents that have created damage to your home, you can add those 2 together. So if you got a $40,000 damage one year and a $60,000 damage the next year, that's $100,000 worth of damage. Now, if your home is only worth $180,000, that $100,000 is over 50% of the $180,000.
Right.
By $10,000. Then you must come into compliance. The whole structure must meet the local building code, which will probably say you need to elevate or relocate.
Exactly, yeah. We're going to have to leave it there because we are out of time. FEMA.gov is the website, correct?
FEMA.gov. I encourage people to peruse through it. There is so much information there. There are publications, coastal zone construction books that are free. Mm-hmm. They're mailed to you free. That's part of being in America. So if you educate yourself, you're going to be prepared.
Jim Zemlicka, the FEMA reservist, I should say, but that title certainly doesn't do you justice considering all that you do. Thanks for being on the show, for 2 shows, in fact.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. You can see this show and many others on our YouTube site. We'll see you next time. Take care.